The mountain had no name, for none dared name what they could not tame. Shrouded in swirling mists that never parted, it stood like a silent sentinel over the lands, its peak a realm where mortals feared to tread. At its zenith hung the midnight bell, a creation of ancient magic so profound that even time itself answered its call. It was not an ordinary bell, for no hand could ring it. The midnight bell sang only once a year, when the old year died and the new was born. Its chime was more than sound. It was the pulse of existence, the heartbeat of the universe. When its toll resonated at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, the world exhaled the past and embraced the promise of what was to come. But envy is an ancient beast, and even the purest light casts a shadow. Among the ethereal, where beings of immense power walked, a fairy of starlight and a witch of shadows turned their gaze toward the bell. The fairy longed for its radiance, dreaming of a light so blinding it would drown the stars themselves. The witch, dark and cunning, craved its sound, imagining a toll so haunting it would silence every whisper of the world. One fateful night, beneath a sky heavy with falling stars, the two struck a pact. The fairy, with her magic of illumination, and the witch, with her spells of concealment, conspired to steal the midnight bell. They wrapped their enchantments around it like threads of silk and shadow, weaving a prison of light and dark. With an incantation that echoed through the heavens, they tore the bell from its sacred perch and sealed it in a hidden dimension, a labyrinth so twisted that no mortal, no matter how determined, could find their way to its heart. The world changed that night. At first there was silence, a silence so profound it seemed to seep into the marrow of the earth. When the next New Year's Eve came and went without the bell's chime, time faltered. The seasons began to lose their rhythm. Spring lingered in winter's grip, and summer faded before it could bloom. The days grew sluggish, their edges blurred, until the concept of time itself began to dissolve. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed the gods had turned their backs on the world, while others spoke of a curse, a punishment for humanity's sins. But among the stories, one truth emerged. The midnight bell was gone, and without it, the world was unraveling. The fairy and the witch revelled in their success, though unease simmered beneath their triumph. The labyrinth, a masterpiece of their combined powers, had become more than a prison. It was alive, shifting and twisting with every passing moment. They could no longer see the bell, only feel its presence. And even that was fading. Their greed had blinded them to the labyrinth's true nature, and now it seemed to mock their control. Still, they comforted themselves with the belief that no one would ever reach the bell. After all, what mortal could navigate a maze born of opposing magics, let alone break the enchantments that bound it? But the world, even in its slow decay, is not without champions. Far from the mountain, in a kingdom cloaked in perpetual twilight, two children of destiny stirred. Dreams of the midnight bell whispered to them, and a voice, neither male nor female, but as old as the stars, began to call. The bell's absence was a wound in the fabric of existence, and as the end of the year approached, its silence became unbearable. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth, the midnight bell waited, its magic dim but not extinguished. And so the first seeds of hope were sown. The bell, though imprisoned, was not lost. Not yet. It is said that when light and shadow entwine, the world shudders, for such unions are not born of harmony, but of necessity. The Fairy of Starlight and the Witch of Shadows, though bound by their shared ambition, regarded each other with the wary eyes of predators circling prey. Their pact had been struck not out of trust, but out of greed, each seeking to use the other to claim the midnight bell for themselves. Their labyrinth was a work of terrible beauty. Threads of starlight wove paths of shimmering illusions, leading the unwary toward infinite false horizons. Shadows thick as ink pooled in corners, twisting into phantoms that whispered fears and lies into the ears of intruders. Together, their magics created a maze that defied time and logic. A place where even the most steadfast heart might falter. The pact was simple on the surface. They would guard the bell together, sharing its power once the world's last futile attempt to reclaim it had failed. Yet the fairy and the witch each wove hidden clauses into the enchantments, seeds of betrayal planted in the fertile soil of their distrust. For the fairy, the labyrinth's shifting paths were attuned to the purity of intent. Those with hearts untouched by shadow might find the way, though at great cost. For the witch, the phantoms whispered truths laced with venom, testing the resolve of those who dared to enter. Should a seeker succumb to doubt, the maze would swallow them whole. Though they claimed partnership, neither fully trusted the other's craft. The fairy often lingered in the labyrinth's outer edges, her radiant wings casting rippling light through the shadows, seeking signs of the witch's meddling. The witch, ever watchful, wandered the darker corridors, her footsteps silent as the creeping fog, her sharp eyes probing the fairy's delicate threats of light for weaknesses. Their suspicion grew, yet they dared not break the labyrinth's fragile equilibrium. To do so would risk unraveling their creation, and neither would yield the bell to the other. Thus, the labyrinth became as much a prison for the conspirators as it was for the midnight bell itself. But the labyrinth was no mere construct. It had grown sentient, feeding on the conflicting magics that sustained it. Over time, it began to evolve, creating new chambers and pathways that neither the fairy nor the witch had envisioned. It mocked their designs, its power stretching beyond their grasp. The bell, imprisoned at the labyrinth's heart, seemed to pulse faintly with defiance, its magic subtly undermining the enchantments that bound it. And so, the fairy and the witch found themselves trapped in a silent war, each vying for dominance within the maze they had built together. Though they wielded vast power, the labyrinth had become an entity unto itself, and even they could no longer predict its movements. Their uneasy alliance grew colder with each passing year. The witch, in her darkened halls, began to dream of consuming the fairy's light, extinguishing her rival and claiming the labyrinth as her domain. The fairy, perched in her glowing spire, envisioned scattering the witch's shadows, erasing her presence from the world entirely. Unseen by either, the labyrinth began to stir in response to a distant call. A spark of courage and unity had ignited in the Twilight Kingdom, where Prince Caelen and Princess Alina had begun their journey. The labyrinth sensed their approach, the purity of their purpose awakening something deep within its core. The fairy and the witch, oblivious to the threat brewing beyond the maze's walls, turned their attention inward, tightening their grasp on the labyrinth's power. They failed to notice the faint tremor in the air, the subtle shift in the labyrinth's endless corridors, as if it were preparing for the arrival of something or someone it had been waiting for. The midnight bell remained silent, but its magic stirred faintly, resonating with the footsteps of those who carried the hope of a world unraveling. Though the labyrinth had become a cage, its purpose had not been forgotten. Deep within its heart, the midnight bell waited. Time was running out, and the pact of light and shadow was about to be tested. The kingdom of Kelvaris was dying, though no one could name its illness. The sun hung perpetually low, its light pale and sickly, unable to warm the frozen earth. The rivers whispered, but did not flow, and the trees held their brittle leaves in defiance of seasons that no longer turned. People moved like shadows, their days blending into one another as if caught in an eternal twilight. In the midst of this slow decay stood Prince Caelen and Princess Alina, twins born on the cusp of a new year, their destinies intertwined with time itself. They were the last flickers of vitality in a kingdom grown numb, their hearts restless with the yearning for a world they had only glimpsed in faded stories. For years they shared the same dream, a bell suspended in a void, its golden surface darkened but pulsing faintly with life. Around it, a labyrinth shifted and whispered, its corridors calling to them in a language they did not understand but instinctively knew. Each dream ended with a single haunting plea, "Find me." The visions were a secret between them, a bond that deepened their already unbreakable connection. One cold, endless evening, Alina found Caelen standing in the royal archives, a single scroll unfurled before him. His face, pale and sharp as the winter sky, was alight with a rare fervor. "It's real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The midnight bell. The scroll spoke of a bell that governed time, hidden by two ancient beings whose names were lost to history. It told of a labyrinth, a shifting maze that could only be traversed by those of pure intent. At its center lay the bell, waiting for those brave or desperate enough to reclaim it. Alina's breath caught. You think it's the same bell from the dream? I don't think, Caelen replied, his grey eyes locking with hers. I know. The scroll also contained a map, faded and incomplete, but unmistakably depicting the labyrinth's entrance. It lay far to the north, at the edge of the world where even the stars seemed hesitant to shine. Though the court scoffed at their resolve, calling their quest foolish and their dreams madness, the twins did not waver. They prepared quietly, gathering supplies and donning cloaks, lined with fur to guard against the biting cold. At dawn, or what passed for it in their dim kingdom, they slipped away, their departure marked only by the hollow sound of the palace gates closing behind them. Their journey was a trial in itself. The frozen plains stretched endlessly, broken only by jagged peaks that loomed like the bones of giants. They passed villages where people had long stopped caring for the passing of time, their faces slack with resignation. Everywhere, the silence was deafening. But the twins pressed on, guided by the map and the unshakable conviction that their dream was not a coincidence. At night, they huddled together for warmth, the pale stars above watching them like distant, indifferent eyes. One night, as they camped beneath the jagged shadow of a cliff, a figure appeared at the edge of their firelight. It was neither man nor beast, but something caught between, its body cloaked in mist, its eyes gleaming like fragments of broken glass. You seek the labyrinth, it said, its voice carrying the weight of countless ages. Do you understand what lies within? Caelen stood, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. We understand enough. The figure laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. Do you, prince of a fading kingdom? Do you, princess of a dying time? The labyrinth does not merely test the body, it tests the soul. Alina stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. And our souls are ready. The figure inclined its head, as though conceding a point. It raised a hand, and from the mist behind it, the faint outline of a great archway began to form. Then enter, if you dare. But know this, the labyrinth knows your heart better than you do. It will not forgive hesitation. The archway solidified, its surface rippling like water. Beyond it lay a darkness so complete that even the firelight seemed unable to penetrate it. The figure began to fade, its voice lingering like smoke. The midnight bell waits, but it tolls for none who falter. Caelen and Alina exchanged a single glance, their resolve mirrored in each other's eyes. Without a word, they stepped through the archway and into the labyrinth. The darkness swallowed them whole, and the air grew thick with the whispers of unseen things. The labyrinth had claimed its challengers, and their trial had begun. The air inside the labyrinth was heavy, dense with a silence that seemed alive. It clung to Caelen and Alina like a second skin, muffling even the sound of their own footsteps. The archway that had admitted them was gone, dissolved into the swirling void. In its place stretched corridors of impossibility, walls of light that shimmered like distant starlight, and shadows so deep they seemed to devour thought itself. At first the path seemed clear. A single corridor stretched ahead, narrow and featureless. But as the twins stepped forward, the wall shifted, undulating like the coils of a living serpent. The labyrinth began to hum faintly, as though sensing their presence, and the air grew colder with every step. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. But as they pressed deeper into the maze, the voices grew clearer, speaking words meant to unnerve and unravel. "Unworthy," they hissed. "Fools chase in a dream. Turn back while you still can." Caelen clenched his jaw, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. "Ignore them," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. "They're only illusions." But Alina hesitated. The whispers carried a weight she could not ignore, a familiarity, as though the voices belonged to people she had known, people she had loved and lost. She glanced at her brother, his resolve etched into the lines of his face, and forced herself to move forward. The labyrinth was merciless in its cunning. Each turn led to new trials, each more disorienting than the last. At one point, they found themselves in a hall of mirrors, their reflections distorted into grotesque caricatures. The mirrors whispered dark truths, each one more piercing than the last. "You cannot save what is already lost," Alina's reflection sneered, its eyes glinting with malice. "You will fail her, as you always have," Caelen's image hissed, its voice a venomous echo. The siblings closed their eyes, stepping forward blindly, until the mirrors shattered into dust behind them. As they pressed on, the labyrinth began to reveal the true nature of its power. It was not merely a test of strength or intellect. It was a crucible of the soul. Every corridor seemed designed to strip away their defenses, exposing their deepest fears and weaknesses. At one juncture, the path split into two, each route shrouded in thick mist. A figure emerged, a spectre of indistinct form, its voice soft and cold. "Only one may pass. The other must remain behind." The twins exchanged a glance, their bond stronger than the labyrinth's deception. Without hesitation, they stepped forward together, ignoring the figure's warnings. The mist hissed in frustration, but parted, allowing them to continue. Each trial tested their trust, their unity, and their willingness to sacrifice for one another. Caelen, at one point, was faced with a vision of the throne of Selvaris, restored to its former glory, but only if he abandoned Alina to the Labyrinth. He stepped away without a second thought, the illusion fading with a sound like breaking glass. Alina, too, was tested. In one chamber, she was shown a vision of the world healed, the sun shining and time flowing once more. A voice whispered that this future could be hers, but only if she walked away from her brother. She turned from the vision, tears streaking her face, and rejoined Caelen. Finally, after what felt like days, but could have been mere moments, the labyrinth's shifting walls began to calm. The corridors grew narrower, the air heavier with the weight of their nearing destination. The whispers faded, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats. They reached a great chamber at the labyrinth's heart, its walls glowing faintly with golden light. At its center stood the midnight bell, encased in a glass dome that shimmered with threads of starlight and shadow. The bell was beautiful, but its light was dim, as though it were holding its breath. Around it swirled a faint mist, the remnants of the fairies' and witches' enchantments still clinging to their stolen prize. But before they could step closer, a voice rang out. A voice both familiar and alien, cold yet full of fire. "You've come far," it said, echoing through the chamber. The fairy and the witch appeared, their forms materializing from light and shadow. The fairy's wings glimmered with a deadly radiance, while the witch's dark robes billowed as though stirred by an invisible wind. "Too far," the witch added, her smile sharp as a blade. Caelen and Alina stood their ground, the midnight bell just out of reach. The final confrontation had begun, and with it, the last test of their resolve. The labyrinth grew silent, holding its breath for the toll of destiny. The chamber seemed to breathe with a life of its own, pulsing faintly, as if responding to the presence of its creators and their challengers. The midnight bell loomed in the center, its golden surface dull but resonant, as though it could sense the weight of the moment. The Fairy of Starlight and the Witch of Shadows stood on opposite sides of the chamber, their forms flickering like reflections on water. Their presence was both commanding and unnatural, the embodiment of opposing forces that had no business coexisting. "You've made it farther than any mortal before you," the fairy said, her voice smooth and crystalline. Her glowing eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her wings casting a harsh light that made the shadows recoil. "But this is the end. The midnight bell is beyond your grasp." The witch sneered, her voice a low, venomous hiss. "Indeed. Do you think mere mortals can undo the will of those who created this place? Your defiance amuses me, but it ends here." Caelen tightened his grip on his sword, though he knew it would do little against beings of such power. "We didn't come this far to fail," he said, his voice steady. He glanced at Alina, who stood beside him. Her gaze locked on the bell. She nodded, a silent exchange of resolve passing between them. The fairy laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Oh, such bravery! But bravery alone cannot break the enchantments binding the bell. She gestured toward the dome of light and shadow that encased the midnight bell. "It is beyond your reach, locked by magic older than your bloodline." The witch stepped forward, her robes trailing darkness like spilled ink. "And even if you could break it, the cost would be greater than you could bear. Are you willing to pay a price you cannot comprehend?" Alina took a step forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "What price? Tell us, and we will decide if it is too great." The fairy and the witch exchanged a glance, their mutual distrust momentarily set aside. The fairy's radiant form dimmed slightly, her voice tinged with mock pity. "The bell's prison can only be broken by sacrifice. A piece of your soul must be given freely, irrevocably lost. And not just any piece," the witch added, her eyes glinting with cruel delight. "The part of you that defines you most. For him," she pointed to Caelen, "it is your voice, your command, your power to lead. And for her," she turned to Alina, "it is your sight, your light, your ability to see the path forward." Caelen's jaw tightened, his mind racing. His voice was more than just a means of speech. It was his presence, his ability to rally others, to lead his kingdom in its time of need. And for Alina, her sight was her world, her connection to beauty and understanding. To lose these would be to lose a piece of themselves, but the alternative was unthinkable. Alina stepped forward before Caelen could speak, her voice steady. "If that is the price, then I will pay it." "No!" Caelen turned to her, his voice rising with urgency. "You can't!" "Caelen." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm but gentle. "This is bigger than us. If we don't act now, there will be no kingdom left to save. I'm willing." "And so am I," he said, his voice softening. "We do this together." The fairy and the witch watched, their expressions unreadable. The labyrinth seemed to hum with approval, the walls glowing faintly as if recognizing the purity of their intent. Caelen and Alina approached the bell, their hearts heavy but resolute. As they reached out, a faint golden light began to emanate from their hands, intertwining and growing brighter. The dome of light and shadow flickered violently, resisting the intrusion, but their combined will proved stronger. With a deafening crack, the glass shattered, and the midnight bell was freed. Its surface glowed with renewed brilliance, its chime echoing faintly through the chamber as though awakening from a long slumber. The fairy and the witch recoiled, their forms beginning to dissolve as the bell's magic surged outward. The labyrinth trembled, its walls collapsing in a cascade of light and shadow. Caelen and Alina stood before the bell, their sacrifices taking hold. Caelen's voice left him, his throat tightening with an unnatural silence. Alina's vision faded into darkness, her last sight the radiant glow of the midnight bell. But as the bell tolled at the stroke of midnight, its sound filled the world, resonating through time itself. The seasons began to turn, the sun rose anew, and the kingdom of Xelvaris stirred from its frozen slumber. The fairy and the witch, their powers consumed by the bell's light, vanished into the ether, their ambitions undone by the selflessness they could never comprehend. Caelen and Alina emerged from the labyrinth to a world reborn. Though changed, their bond remained unbroken, and their sacrifices became the foundation of a brighter future. And as the midnight bell tolled each New Year's Eve, it carried the memory of two souls who had given everything to save the world from endless twilight.